And now we are going to hear from David Ferris with the Louisiana Department of Justice. And I had the awesome opportunity to hear him over the weekend with the Women Caucus. And his testimony and his what he shared with us was just jaw dropping, life changing. And I told him that he needs to speak all over the state, especially to parents in terms of things that we need to be aware of. And then joining him is Erica Mac
McClellan.
McEllen, and also with the Louisiana Department of Justice. And so you have checked off, I'm present and we'll provide information, but we're going to ask you to speak. And certainly, I know that you guys have heard so much today that you probably would like to comment on. So we're going to start ladies first, or?
Well, I'll go ahead and start and actually give you guys an update.
Okay.
There was two things that were addressed in the last conversation that people were questioning as to what was the current status.
Yes. Yes. Thank
Currently,
you.
13 different facilities are offline at the moment. That ranges from sheriff's office to police departments to different things like that. And in reference to what is the current status of, I believe, Tommy Mouton. So he was released March 2nd of last year from Angola and immediately committed to Villa Feliciana, which is a secured mental institution in, I believe, West Feliciana?
East
Feliciana.
Yeah.
And we're still trying to figure out whether that was a court-ordered commitment or whether that was a end-of-sentence voluntary commitment. Most likely, based upon the notes that we're seeing, is most likely a court-ordered transfer from Angola to this mental institution. So I don't know the term of service there, whether he would ever get out, what that process looks like, but that's where he's currently residing.
I'm just shaking my head. Just go ahead, because something else come to mind that I talked to you about in terms of.
Okay, to give you the 2-second version of who I am and what we do for the Attorney General's office. So my name is David Ferris. Again, my job role is I'm the supervisory special agent over the cyber crimes unit. In addition to that, I am the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force Commander for the state. So that role encompasses basically essentially every internet crime against children that comes into the state of Louisiana. We were speaking Saturday, and I was giving the senator a brief kind of update on the state of internet crimes in the state of Louisiana. And without the pretty charts and everything in front of us, I'll just give you the 2-second version of that. And about 3 years ago, we received about 2,000 cases a year. About COVID started happening, and somewhere along this line, we decided it was a great idea to put people in their houses, not let them go anywhere, put them behind computers, put kids on the same internet, and expect bad things not to happen. That number went from about 2,500 2 years ago to we're right at 6,000 cases this year. And what I told the senator was we have 6 agents. So 6,000 cases for 6 agents means I have 1,000 cases per agent. This is not what you guys want to hear, but this is the reality of where we are. This is a war and we're losing it. And it simply boils down to there's more offenses and more crimes than we can possibly handle. So the mission of this committee is even more important than you guys could ever imagine, because we're looking at a situation of not, and a lot of the different testimony I heard, and I don't want to take anything from anybody else, but most of that testimony was, okay, great. He's been arrested, he's been convicted, now what do we do? But that's not the purpose of this body. The purpose of this body is to step back and say, what can we do to make this not ever happen? How do we prevent that victim from ever becoming a victim? Guys, I don't have all the right answers. I'll tell you, I don't have the PhDs behind my names. I'll tell you that I'm not the attorney. I don't sit on the head of any department. I'm just telling you from the boots on the ground what I see working these cases. And it is an incredibly difficult task that you guys have been given. One really unique aspect of my job is we work internet crimes against children. And so what that looks like for us, it's as close as you could possibly get to a Minority Report situation. And the movie Minority Report is the thought crimes. You're arresting people before the crime actually occurs. You're looking into the private thoughts of individuals and what they're willing to say online in a private chat room, or what they're willing to share with an individual that they assume will never be seen by light. I asked the congressman this weekend, senator this weekend, I'll go back to that statement. I absolutely think this conversation has to be a twofold approach. We absolutely have to have that preventative measure. We have to have the counseling. We have to have the victim advocate side as well as the victim information side. We have to empower these individuals to not become victims to begin with. But once they become victims, what do they do with that information, as well as with these offenders? I've heard a number of different guys we've interviewed say, I wish I had a place I could go to and talk to. Now, I don't know if that's because they're in handcuffs sitting in the back of our interview room that they're saying, I wish I could have talked to somebody before. I might not have done this. I couldn't tell you that. But I've heard that a number of times. I can also tell you that that aspect of this is only one aspect of it. It's trust but verify situation. If we simply focus all of our eggs in one basket and simply say we are going to provide everything on the counseling, everything on this, and just assume that's going to work, then we're setting ourselves up for failure. Because we have to have that second component of, whether some people agree with it or not, the strict sex offender registries, the precaution to society. One statement that I don't want to get adversarial with, but I take huge difference in, is that these sex offender registries cause more harm to the offender than they would the potential safety of society. Delicately saying this, the moment you have committed that offense against a child, I'm not saying you are not part of society. I'm not saying you cannot be a very advocate or a very instrumental part of society. I'm saying you have chosen in that action to give up some of your rights. And that right may simply be, you know what, it sucks, but my face is on a postcard. But I cannot step back and say that that postcard or that registration requirement is more damaging to the offender than how many victims we might have saved. And this is going to be one of those negatives you can never prove. This is what my case, this is what my job is working cases where we arrest people for crimes online, but how many kids did we save in that process? And that's a number that you could never quantify, because that's an offender that has not actually offended on a child, or that has never been disclosed of. This is a huge misnomer in any conversation we talk about with sex offenders, and all the studies you hear about. Most of what you've just heard was in reference to recidivism rates after conviction, counseling and group therapy, and absolutely. But what we have to understand is the vast majority of offenders, again, I was harping on, in my own mind, some of the speakers for making generalizations, so I'm going to try to do this, not to do the same thing. But the studies have shown that quite a few of these offenders, the majority of these offenders, when they get arrested, that's not their first offense. That's not even the first time they've gotten caught. Because if you look at the stats of our criminal justice system, it's between 2 and 13% of offenders that are arrested. Those cases actually end up, I'm sorry, there's like 29% actually end up in an actual conviction. And so when we end up with a situation of these cases are coming forward, the offenses are coming forward to police, how many offenses occurred prior to that offense ever coming to a police officer? And at that point in time, what's the actual conviction rate? And we're talking less than a third of sex offenses are actual conviction rate. So if we start this process discussing the conviction rate, and that's how we're going to judge these offenders by, then you're already missing 2/3 of offenders, if not more, based upon our entire conversation. So we have to take this on as a whole, and we have to step back and say, yes, that study is great, but there's 50 other studies that counter that study. Those studies are so wide that I would just caution this body to not to put all the eggs in one basket on one study, because there are so many of them out there that will contradict depending upon what you look at. I mean, the old adage is like 97.6% of stats are made up. Well, I mean, the same thing happens with scientific studies. Is I can find a doctor that will say one thing and he's going to find his study. Or based upon the method he uses for this study, he's going to get certain results. Mm-hmm. And so there absolutely has to be the scientific and therapeutic approach to it, but that can't be the only approach to what we're talking about. There's a concern with the law enforcement community where, and I'll be blunt with this. This is where I see the burnout in my unit. Is there are so many cases. It's a tidal wave of tragedy, where we sit back and I've got these 6 guys killing themselves. They ran 4 search warrants today. They're in Jefferson Parish right now running search warrants. So they ran 4 search warrants today. They're making arrests. They're doing the best they can to save these children. And what's their reward? They get to go back to their desk and see the 50 more cases that were assigned to them today. And so there is definitely a resource issue put into the preventative side of this, not only from just being able to process the rape kits, to put law enforcement officers on the street, but to actually target things like the internet side of what these individuals are doing, because that's giving you a window to their soul. Miss Erica is on our sex offender registry group. She is basically in charge of a lot of these registration processes, and she's kind of I think you explained it earlier, that you were kind of the gateway to a lot of these appeals. And
if I might, Erica McClellan, I'm a prosecutor with the Attorney General's office and
Pull the mic a little bit closer to you.
prosecutor with the AG's office, and I do manage our sex offender registration unit. We work closely in conjunction with state police. Again, most of my work is post-conviction when I'm not prosecuting sex offenses. And the post-conviction matters that we do, what he's referencing is that there is a mechanism that the legislature provided for tier 1 offenders. We have 3 different tiers of offenders once convicted by severity of offense, which is broken down by statute. Those that are considered in the least severe category, the tier 1 offenders that register for 15 years, have an option to seek relief of the last 5 years if they can prove that they've been compliant with all of their registration and notification requirements for the first 10 years. And it's not just a passage of time. And in a way, we've been sort of designated by the legislature as gatekeepers along with state police to do these comprehensive reviews of the offenders who file these petitions to make sure that they've adhered to all of the compliance requirements and actually sustained a clean record for the requisite time. And one of those requirements is that the offender has to have successfully completed an appropriate sex offender treatment program. And what it's referencing is something that came in through Act 848 under the Department of Health and Hospitals, and I don't recall the exact year, but it provides an entire database of psychological registered treatment providers for sex offenders specifically that can assess recidivism rates, work with them individually and or in groups on addressing the reasons behind why they commit offenses, and consider working with them on how to come up with a plan to obviously not recidivate, but also develop a way to go through life managing those issues. And you know, the process for seeking this relief doesn't require a certificate necessarily from one of those treatment providers. And a lot of times the offenders that are released on parole or probation, for those lesser severe offenses, they have to attend treatment classes as a condition of probation. So they're out in the public, they're registering in the community, but while they're on probation, they have to attend these treatment classes. And I think it's subject to the court's direction as to how frequent, how often. I'm not entirely familiar with that, part of the process. But if they complete their period of probation and they complete the treatment classes while they're on probation, that has become acceptable among agencies as sufficient, and among the courts as sufficient treatment for purposes of early relief. Again, I don't know exactly what those courses entail and whether they vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction across the state, but I do believe they're group sessions and not individualized sessions. And whether or not that could be broadened, I'm sure depends on resources. I'm sure it depends on resources. And, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a counselor, I'm not a psychologist, but from the work that I've done in registration, it seems to me, piggybacking on what Mr. Ferris has said, that, you know, there's definitely a mental health component there, that if we could establish a way to work with them in advance of, you know, it's like the precognition. How do you get someone to go to treatment before they've even committed an offense that you don't know they're going to commit until they do it? And so that, I'm sure, creates one of the biggest issues that we're facing here today. So
One of the leading psychologists dealing with these types of offenders is a gentleman named Joe Sullivan from Ireland, and he does a lot of these types of training, and basically spent his entire life counseling and treating sex offenders. The statements I'm making are from his research, not my own. So I mean, I'm not that smart. Essentially, what he was instructing, the way he was explaining, is that about age 13, 14, puberty is when most individuals start identifying their sexual interest. And that is not exclusive to just male, female, non-binary, any of the other ones you want to say. That also includes your sexual interest in children. So most of the individuals that he has dealt with or treated have understood that they were sexually attracted to children from even in their late teens. When they began acting out on it, what their motivation was. There are so many nuances, clause to this, that absolutely they could be a non-preferential offender. Absolutely they could be a sadist, where the act that they're getting pleasure from is the hurting of that child. There are so many different variations and motivations that this is not a one-size-fits-all treatment. And I believe that that individual side of it is as crucial a component to this as anything else. For nothing more than, if I put 20 people in a room, are they really going to, for an hour or 2 hours or 10 hours a month, is that what we are going to base the safety of society on? There has to be more of a component to that. I liken this, and this is again from my non-educated perspective, but I liken this to almost an alcoholic situation. And please understand, I'm not saying alcoholics are pedophile or vice versa. I'm just saying that we're dealing with an addiction. We're dealing with something that an alcoholic can go to treatment, they can go to AA, they can go to counseling, they can get a support structure. But in the end of the day, they're going to step back and say, I still want to drink, but we're providing them the tools not to put themselves in that environment. We're not allowing that individual to go work in a bar, because let's just face it, if I have an alcoholic who's a bar back, he's going to start drinking at some point in time, probably. In that same notion, we have to have those safeguards in place on both sides of it. This is not a situation where I can take an individual and put him through X amount of counseling, and then this is just kind of wave our hands of him and he's now done. For this reason, this is my thought process on this, is the body that's sitting in front of me. If I were to say, how much counseling would it take, as a counselor, I'm going to put you through group sessions, individual sessions, it doesn't matter. How much counseling could I give you for you to believe that it is okay for you to have sex with a child? And the body sitting back looking here would say that there's no amount of counseling you could be put through. There's no amount of therapy I could give you to convince you that society is wrong and raping a child is good. So why would we then assume that the vice versa is accurate? Now, I will say, absolutely, there are hundreds of motivations for offending, and there's all kinds of different circumstances. You have the husband, the wife, the couple, like all these things you guys have already heard today. But when we take this approach, we must be incredibly cautious with that step, that we are not saying that is what we are approaching, and we're foregoing the protection of society, because those components must be working in tandem. And if they don't work in tandem, if one fails, the other one's going to fail as well. So as we go forward with this process, this almost has to be a holistic approach, where we are building up a number of different factors. I can tell you, I've heard courts mentioned a couple times. I have been in a number of cases where the individual who was arrested for thousands of images of prepubescent child porn, watching videos and images of 6, 7, 8-year-old kids being raped, was allowed to plead guilty to computer tampering because the DA wanted to, or the ADA wanted to get it off his docket, and the individual would not plead to a sex offense. So that individual who spent years collecting child porn or child sexual abuse material isn't even in this conversation. because he is nowhere to be found on any registry. He's never seen a single counselor because his crime was computer tampering. So if we are looking at this solely from a perspective of what he pled guilty to, then we are missing a large portion of our true offenders. So, ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your time, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you may have. Again, this is from a boots on the ground perspective, not I'm treating offenders on a regular basis, or I'm advocating for a victim on a regular basis. But I can just tell you what we are seeing and how the approach is coming.
I was intrigued with your presentation at our retreat, and just listening to the both of you, kind of like you guys almost are like the icing on the testimony here today, has almost brought this whole thing full circle, have my mind going about 50 million different directions at the same time, because things have changed. And so one of the things that I know we heard early on in terms of the victims normally being someone that's in the immediate family, but because technology is now part of our world, that could be really alternating and changing because of the level of access and the ability in children who may want to feel a part of, or feeling lonely, or whatever is going on with the child who somebody they think is their age but it's an adult, reaches out to them and begins to lure them in and build trust with them, and then all of a sudden they find themselves in a particular situation. And I'm so that was one of the things that was said earlier. Then certainly one of the things that you talked about, Ms. Erica, in terms of the labeling, and that was something we talked about in our last hearing, like how do you know, right? And so we want to be careful with that, but at the same time, just as you stated, in terms of what the science say in terms of people who kind of identify early on by the age of 13, how do we begin to connect those dots are very important. And I don't know if you have the answer, but I think that is part of what we need to be making sure that we do. I mean, just yesterday, I think in Livingston, the councilman, with his own money, looked into their library system, right? And the access that young people are having in terms of being able to go on and look at pornography sites. That was very troubling. I'm going like, where else is this happening? I mean, our world has certainly changed a whole lot, and I think the way that we look at it has to be completely different, and we have to make sure that it has to be a holistic approach.
I think one of the statements I made to you on Saturday fits that comment very well, and it was something that a friend told me when I became a father just recently, and he said, you can't raise your kids like you were raised, because the world you were raised in doesn't exist anymore. And so if one of the most dangerous statements we could ever make is we do it this way because that's the way it's always been done. And so I think we have to be able to step outside that perspective. For instance, what is a victim? So please understand, I'm not setting this category as more of a victim than this category, but this goes to the education component, because you mentioned that the world's getting smaller with the internet. So is the victim that is being molested in her home any more of a victim than the child that's being coerced into producing child porn online by a guy 500 miles away? And I think we really get into a bad area when we start putting down this victim's more of a victim than this victim. And this is a much larger, broader issue dealing with the sexual abuse of our children. And so there's a huge education component into not only the court system. I can't tell you how many judges, and their names don't matter, have made the statement, well, it's just a picture crime. Why would I give this guy 20 years because he's just looking at pictures on his computer at his own home? Well, I mean, there's a much bigger issue dealing with that statement, in that, number one, this is not just a picture crime. You have a live child being raped somewhere. We have stopped even referring to this as child pornography. Now, legally, by legal definitions, pornography involving juvenile, but that's not really what you're looking at. You are looking at what we consider CSAM, or child sexual abuse material. You are looking at the crime scene footage of a child being raped. And that's the best way we can explain this. So is this truly just a guy sitting in his house looking for an outlet so he doesn't abuse a child? Well, this is probably an off-colored comment, but I'll make it anyway. I'm a heterosexual male, so therefore the content and the material you'd expect me to see or expect me to look at on my phone or my computer would be of women. If I was a gay male, then you'd expect me to have content or images or websites of men. So when I start finding content, images, and stories and videos of children, what am I left to assume?
Yeah.
I'm left to assume that that is the sexual interest of an individual, and given the opportunity, that individual would then act out on that opportunity. And if that is a wrong statement, it may be, but I'm not willing to take that chance with that innocent child. I will happily say I was wrong, but we still protected the child over, you know what, you're right. We probably shouldn't have segregated this individual because he wasn't going to offend, but we missed all the other ones who did offend. So
Very well said. Yeah, I agree. Before I turn the mic over to you, Ms. Lamondre, the tier system that you referred to
Yes, ma'am.
when they are released, who is responsible for that, and what does it look like, and how many tiers are there?
Sure. So it's laid out in revised statute 15541 that defines the different sex offenses that require registration in Louisiana. And subsections 542 through 544 are the bulk of the registration laws, where they break down who has to register in what way and what they have to do for registration, etc. To answer your question, there are 3 tiers, which was established in 2008 when our state substantially became compliant with SORNA and the federal requirements by overhauling our registration obligations. It used to just be 10 years for anybody who was convicted of what was defined a sex offense. In 2008, that was changed to the 3 tiers that we have now. Tier 1 offenders register for 15 years, and most commonly you see those are indecent behavior with a juvenile, carnal knowledge of a juvenile, obscenity under a particular subsection that requires registration, felony contrib to the delinquency of juveniles performing sexual immoral acts. Those kinds of offenses are a 15-year registration. Tier 2 offenders register for 25 years, and this is from either the date of conviction if they're not immediately remanded to incarceration, or from the date of release from incarceration, the registration obligation begins to run. The 25-year registrations are your pornography involving juveniles, whether it's possession, distribution, production, computer-aided solicitation of a minor, molestation of a juvenile, so more severe levels of offenses, right? And as we discussed previously, the tier 1 offenders can petition to reduce that period down to 10 years from 15 if they follow certain parameters in statute 15544E. The tier 2 offenders do not have that privilege. They are 25 years, period. And it is a term of compliance with each year, not just the passage of time. Tier 3 offenders register for the duration of their lifetime. Those are the most severe, and or those who have more than one sex offense conviction on separate dates. And so the lifetime registration is quarterly in-person renewals, and all offenders, regardless of tier, are required to do community notification, which are the mail-outs and postings in the local newspaper to anyone within either a 1 mile or 3/10 of a mile radius of their residence. It is once every 5 years, and if they relocate, then they have to do new notifications for the new address, and then another 5 years passes before they do them again. So in theory, for a 15-year registrant, if an offender registers initially, doesn't move, he's only going to do them once, maybe twice more if he's not relieved early for the entire duration of his 15-year registration, in theory. And so the statutes dictate, based on level of offense, what tier you fall into. As far as who determines, time frames and compliance, things like that, it's a dual effort between our office, my unit, the Sexual Predator Unit at the Attorney General's office, and the State Sex Offender Registry through Louisiana State Police. The differences are that if the offender, and this is laid out in revised statute 15544.2, if the offender was convicted or adjudicated of a sex offense in Louisiana, then our office has the authority to make the decision based on a review of facts and applicable law as to what tier he falls into, and or whether the obligation to register continues when that question is raised, and we do an assessment. There's a process where the offender can request further review from us once we've made a decision, and or go directly to the East Baton Rouge Civil Court and file a petition for declaratory judgment or injunctive relief based on any of the decisions that we make. Separately, if an offender was adjudicated or convicted out of state or federally or through the military or a tribal court, state police is responsible for assessing whether that statute of conviction has a Louisiana equivalent to the elements of the offense that would require registration in Louisiana, and then based on what the laws provide, how long that registration period would be. And that's under 15543.1.
Okay. Very good.
Excuse me,
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm going to definitely look all those up. Okay, Ms. Lamondre.
Thank you. First, I wanted to say thank you to Erica specifically. I know you've worked with one of my colleagues, Arizola Cleaves, on a case, and actually you may have even thought of the case y'all worked on earlier during the presentation when Shannon was talking about female and male perpetration of another victim. That once you came up, I was like, that's interesting, because I know you worked on a case like that. And thank you for your support of survivors in obtaining justice for them,
Absolutely.
in particular that case. The first thing I do want to just bring up, one of the things that was mentioned by you, Mr. David, was about, like, you know, who are we defining as a victim? And, you know, when you said that, it made me think of some survivors that are adults that we've seen at STAR, who they were victims of childhood sexual abuse. And because of that victimization, maybe throughout their life, they become promiscuous or engage in, you know, have relationships that are not great, and then they get victimized again as adults, and then nobody believes them because they're, you know, told that they're promiscuous, or, you know. And I hope everyone keeps that in mind, because really we're not seeing enough people report, we're not seeing enough convictions or arrest, or, you know, through all of that whole thing, because survivors are not being believed, and we need to start by believing. And I hope that is a resolution. We typically do a Start by Believing Day. It's the first Wednesday of April each year, where it's a public, you know, campaign to just, it's not saying that we don't allow for people who are accused to, you know, be presumed innocent. What it is saying is we don't presume that a victim is guilty. And we go where the facts lead us. And the harsh reality that we talk to survivors about is that sometimes, because this is a private crime, there isn't enough evidence to make an arrest, there isn't enough evidence to prosecute, and there isn't enough evidence to result in a conviction. And, you know, being upfront with them about that and making sure that they still know that we believe them goes a lot further. And what we do know from research on victims is that they typically can be more traumatized through the reporting and investigation process than the original crime ever was on them. And I think that what are we doing to make sure that survivors can go through this process? Because if we're damaging somebody so much as an individual going through a process, especially a child, we need to think about what that looks like, and where, you know, at what cost are we I guess, trying to take care of public safety. The other thing is, you know, the difference of the worlds we live in. That's true that there are certain things that are crazy now about our world that we live in, but I'm glad that we're in a world now where we can actually talk about this out loud, because a lot of times, I mean, this just was not at all dealt with in families. All we thought about, you were told, you know, growing up, stranger danger, right? I just remember that, you know, don't take candy from strangers. I mean, I know everyone in school, if there's somebody in a van, you know, like that's what we were taught. So I'm glad that we're open to having the conversation, because it was not looked at as something you talked about. And then the other thing about prosecutions, and in particular the plea deals, you know, whose responsibility is it ultimately? Because one of the things that, to me, this comes down to, and I am most concerned about the perpetrators I see who are serial rapists. And David Lisak, he's a great researcher. He coined the term undetected rapists. And on average, his study was people who had never been arrested, never been like accused officially, but on average, they raped 6 times. But the reason they went undetected for so long typically is because they use alcohol to facilitate rape. They choose people who they believe won't be believed. And
Absolutely.
they're the ones who are hunting and preying on LSU and Southern's campuses all the time. And even in his study, even though they did sexually offend against adults, they also offended against children as well. And those are the people that have means and are privileged. And so they're the ones, to me, who I see not at all being reported, but if they are, the deals that they're able to get. So it's like, it's the perception of who we believe is an offender and what they look like. It's not the masked man jumping out of the bushes. It's,
That's a very good point.
John Smith, who just looks like an upstanding citizen and probably donates to charities. And, we have to also stop calling sex offenders monsters, because when we do that, we make it believe like we know what they would look like and they would be the creepy guy, and that's not who they are. They're amongst us, and they are people who are charming. So I just also do believe that there are people who can rehabilitate, and I think we need to be very clear about who are likely to offend again versus not. And for the people who we do see good support systems and a track record, I do believe we have to, we can't condemn them for life forever if they have proven themselves. But I know that it gives people heartache, because it's like, how do you ever truly know? And even as a parent, for me, right? Like I'm like, would I try, I don't know the answer, but I do know that I want us to be proactive. And to me, we really need to start early in schools, teaching kids about their bodies, what's appropriate touch, and we need to be pushed back. And I want to see the AG's office with us. I wrote an op-ed where, because Attorney General Jeff Landry had said that he was wanting to do Louisiana off all the bad lists, and I said I hope he stands with us for supporting comprehensive health education in schools, because I think that's where most of this. It will be a slow shift, but I do believe it's a very necessary shift. So hopefully you all will support us in those efforts.
Well, I can't speak to what that looks like, because I don't know what that is. I can tell you, though, that we spoke about this on Saturday, that education component in the schools is absolutely crucial from a number of perspectives. Number one, it's a perspective of what is not acceptable behavior. Number two is what your rights are if these acceptable behaviors or unacceptable behaviors occur. One of my biggest frustrations in this conversation with more specifically internet crimes, but crimes in general, is that we look at this as a female victim. And we see more, I don't want to say more, we see a number of victims that are males just like females, but we have never created an environment where that is allowed to be spoken. From day one, and this is a very general statement, but from day one, ladies are generally taught that there are bad men out there who intend to do bad things. We have never had that conversation with our young men, so we've, in essence, created a perfect victim class. And so what we are seeing from just a sexting, blackmail, extortion perspective, because that is one of the growing trends now, is kids aren't ashamed anymore, so they're sending images of themselves. And then for a female victim, it tends to be more sexually driven, where the individual is attempting to get more sexual content or arrange meetings, things of that nature. For the male victims, it is a criminal enterprise, where we have two main organizations. You have one based out of the Ivory Coast, one based, I believe, in Nigeria, that nobody's scamming you on the Nigerian lottery anymore. They're just sitting there having conversations with our young men, and they are simply convincing these young men to send images and then immediately start extorting them for cash or for Amazon gift cards. So it is a criminal enterprise. So even in this discussion of victims, like, that was meant to expand the definition, not contrast it. So this is still a victim of a sex crime, but a totally different ulterior motive. Now that's a monetary gain by a criminal organization on the other side of the world. So this is a much bigger issue than, unfortunately, one possible, this is the silver bullet solution. But education has to be part of that. And the earlier the better. We have to get into our schools and teach kids about what that, from my world, for the cyber world, what that digital citizenship looks like, what is okay to say, what behaviors are appropriate or not appropriate. And this is one of my sayings I love to say to all the kids and parents I'm talking to is, again, it goes back to the world we grew up in is different. When I grew up, I got in trouble, I got grounded, I learned my lesson, I was able to make mistakes, and I was able to learn from that mistake, and that mistake went away after that. But the kids nowadays don't have that luxury. The mistakes they make now are memorialized forever on the internet or forever through conversations of text messages. And this goes straight to the heart of the conversation we're having here, is that is another tool or weapon that these individuals can now use to control these child victims or adult victims, is the fear of having this information be displayed to the world. And it would take a matter of moments to send these inappropriate videos, or in the case of alcohol, like you mentioned, does she look like she's involved in it? And then at that point in time, when he says, well, you're here on this video, I'm going to send it to all your friends if you report me. I mean, and that's just, that technology component becomes a much greater thing that we must address at a younger age if we don't expect this to become a problem.
Wow. I'm sitting here thinking, we started off talking about castration, and and to me, it is really just mushroom and blossom into something that is so much more. Not that that's not meaningful or meaty, but just something just so much more. I think that we have to really address. And there's so many more issues that I had not considered, because initially when I started out, my whole thing was, I don't want bad people doing bad things to children, period. And I felt that would be a way to actually stop it. And so I have all this information I've been reading. And again, according to where you get it from, because there's some data that says that there is a matter of control with it, right? And it does work with some people. Then there's some that says that it doesn't. And, I'm going to tell you, the Mouton story really just kind of almost shut me down, honestly, because of a situation that we were facing in my community with someone trying to move a psychiatric facility next to a school. I mean, like, you can walk there just 10 steps away. And so I literally just almost shut down when you were talking, because I'm thinking to myself, okay, so now this is where this individual is. And if they decide to open that up, then he could possibly be right next to a school, which would be candy just laid out before him with no jar. Sometimes I just wonder what we are doing, and how do we make this better. But again, I want to say thank you. I don't want to start rambling. Certainly giving you guys more resources, because I heard you. The 4 guys that you guys sent out this morning, when they came back, they have, I forgot how many cases, but as soon as they came back, they had all these other cases that they have to go and address. So it's nonstop, right? In the world that we do live in is much different than the world that we grew up in, because the world that we grew up in, when lights came on at nighttime or at dawn, we knew to be inside the house. And we knew, as Morgan referred to, don't talk to, the strangers. But now, who are the strangers? And having to redefine all of that in the educational piece as it relates to helping our children much younger. Because they are so much smarter than we are. I mean, the technology just have made them that way. They almost come here born knowing how to operate the device, and they don't even have to be looking for this stuff. It can just come to them. And if they don't know and no one is talking to them about it, then they can be in this whole trap, disillusion, or really in trouble with people that they've never met before. So that's a whole different conversation. But what I like to do at this point is, if anyone on the panel would like to make any comments as we begin to kind of wrap up, because initially I was just going to bring DLC here, but it sounds like now I might need to bring, I don't know, maybe certainly law enforcement, because I like to see their perspective. And you asked a question, Morgan, and I don't know if you answered, like with the plea bargains, that is done with the attorneys and district attorney. Am I correct?
So from my understanding, it is generally done between the defense attorney and the district attorney, to where that then is presented to the judge, who has to accept a plea agreement from I'll speak from, I'll let the attorney in the room speak.
That is the general process. Usually there are concessions on either side. It's an agreement, and a lot of times that does happen because the evidence isn't strong enough to convict, or it doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but proving it beyond a reasonable doubt in the courtroom may not be that feasible or that successful. And so sometimes there may be a perspective, and I can't speak for, this is just personally, there may be a perspective where it may not be the offense that was committed, but if we can at least secure a conviction for something that does require sex offender registration, that does make the victim feel heard and feel that justice is served without putting them through the trauma of testifying again in court in front of their accuser and reliving everything that happened, it may not always be the best way to go either. It's definitely a case-by-case basis, and there's really no one-size-fits-all. And I would venture to say humbly that there are probably a lot more plea agreements that take place for sex offenses than convictions of the actual charged offense for that reason. And sometimes, especially when there's a child victim, you have to consider what it's going to put that child through to go through everything in the courtroom again, and whether that's something that is in the best interest of justice.
Very well said. So I'm going to start on that end with Ms. Library. Hold on for a second. Let me get you on, and we'll just come on down.
Who shared testimony today. That are at play, but some of the things that I didn't hear today, but I think were alluded to, the backlog of rape kits. I can only speak for Orleans Parish. The majority of my profession, I've worked with survivors, and for adult and child survivors of sex crimes, it's a 2-year backlog, I think, is what it is now, and they're still working on standing up a DNA facility to get through that. So, and I think Morgan had touched on the re-traumatization of survivors and what we put them through, and prolonging that process and what that looks like. And I think that also feeds into the plea bargaining and what happens there. I also wanted to bring up, you mentioned Act 848.
Yes,
I predominantly have worked with survivors, and many of them are folks that have been marginalized, formerly incarcerated people, sex workers, people who use drugs, people who don't necessarily trust police or legal systems and don't go that route. So when Senator Navarro had asked us to come back with folks that could inform the commission, I did my research. I found Act 848's website, and I found 49 providers listed. A considerable number are housed within carceral systems, and most of them don't take Medicaid. So when we're talking about the onus being on the person that needs to get that treatment, that needs to seek out an intervention for those behaviors, and the difficulty that presents, I think that's something that we also need to look at. Absolutely. And then when we're talking about folks in the sex offender registry, I've had clients who are unhoused that were on the registry back when we were criminalizing folks for crimes against nature, solicitation, which is essentially a prostitution charge with racial disparities, and now that's been ruled unconstitutional. But were unhoused because they couldn't secure housing because of their status as a sex offender. Their PO told them pick a corner, because they said, I don't know, because they had to send out another mailer because they lost their housing. And so I think that there are a lot of issues that are at play that are feeding into creating extreme areas of unsafety, holes in safety nets. So just wanted to add in, as we're identifying issues at play that are creating, I think, not only opportunities for harm, but also breakdowns in interventions that could happen to assist. I think that's important for us to highlight as well. But thanks to everybody who came out today.
Thank you so much for your comments. Very well taken. And I was taking notes on that too. Ms. Consimino from DCFS. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I do want to say thank you. Thank you for your expertise. Thank you for all of your passion, for sharing all of your time with us today. I agree with you, Senator Barra. There's so much more, I think, to really just almost sit on and think about for a few minutes. But I think we're going in the right direction. So I'm privileged to be a part of this. Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much. We appreciate you being here. Mr. Ringo.
Thank you very much. And yes, thank you to everyone who testified today. I think both of you who testified last really hit the nail on the head when you acknowledge the real challenges that this commission has to really meeting or fulfilling our goal of prevention, because so much of what we have been talking about is too late if we're talking about people who are already incarcerated and are coming home. And we really want to think about ways we can do that where we aren't living in minority report, as you alluded, as you both alluded to, and you know, without pre-convicting people, how can we match services to people who might be at risk? And I think that's such a challenge. I think the one constant thread that I heard was if we aren't unable to do that, and I guess before I would put a pin in, maybe we should look at whether there are any jurisdictions or within the United States or elsewhere who've figured out any way to match these services. And I think the first person who testified mentioned that there have been some, that there was a doctor in Germany who was very successful at identifying services for people who might self-identify as being at risk. So I'd be interested in hearing if there's any actual studies that showed whether those have been successful. But I think a real challenge, the one thread I did hear, if we are unable to do that, is providing this education to children, so that to the greatest extent possible we can help children avoid being victims and know the language to use and know how to keep themselves safe and know how to help the adults in their lives help keep them safe. I think from the prevention end, that is certainly an area that I hope this commission continues to go down.
Thank you so much. Very well taken. Ms. Lamondre.
I was just going to say one other thing, too, about the Medicaid reimbursement rate. That definitely, so lots of providers don't take Medicaid, but the reimbursement rate is low. And the other thing I found out recently from a counseling friend is that there's something different, and I don't know the correct thing, but there's something different about Medicaid where they're obviously, because it is federal dollars, a little bit more stringent on record keeping, and then the time treatment can happen to where they I don't know, Medicaid doesn't want you to have somebody on a caseload for quite as long, even if it's somebody with complex PTSD. And so providers more and more are not accepting Medicaid because of all the hassles of, one, getting reimbursed, but also if they do get reimbursed, it's much lower than private insurance. So I hope that we can also look into that, because we're going to continue to see people who won't take Medicaid at all. So
very good point. Mr. Cassidy.
Hello. I'd like to echo everyone else's sense of gratitude for everyone that came and testified today. It's, you know, taking all the comments in and trying to find an overlying theme. I definitely echo other folks' comments about prevention and education, how absolutely important it is. It's vital. What is it? An ounce of prevention? How's it go? But I mean, those idioms are an idiom for a reason. You know, And how does that look? What does that look like in our state? It has to be some sort of comprehensive sex education in schools, getting advocates before kids, and talking to them about healthy relationships, about rape culture. It is a thing. People hear that phrase and they think that, and they kind of recoil at it sometimes, but it's absolutely a thing. It's the way we view each other. It's the way boys view girls, the way men view women. Sometimes that culture shift needs to happen, and it should happen at an early age. It's something that wasn't available to me as a young kid. I had to rely on the benevolence of my parents, but some people aren't as lucky to have that. So it's got to be a priority for our state to have those educational efforts. And also, we've got to put our money, where our mouth is. So if we want to help folks that already have offended, as the woman testified earlier, if we need to assess these people to figure out how long they need to be in programs, that costs money. We have to pony up for that. And also, funding organizations that have advocates that need to spread the word, like LaFasa, like STAR, those who rely too heavily on federal dollars as opposed to state dollars. That's definitely something that needs to be looked at. So, thanks again. Those are my comments.
Well, thank you so very much, and very well taken. Again, I do want to thank all of you, each of you, for being a part of this. And because of our tight deadline, we have to end the study commission by March 15th. I do want to walk away with something, and it, like I said, it has definitely much bigger than what I anticipated. I really had my heart kind of really set on just going forward with that one thing, thinking that it would really solve all the problems. But not saying that may not be still something that we look at, because we already have surgical castration on the books, and I'd like to know how many people have actually been surgically castrated. I couldn't get that information either before this meeting. So there are a lot of questions that I still personally have. And in our next meeting, I do want to ask, if you guys have anyone in particular that you would like to have. I plan to ask DOC to be here for sure, and I'm thinking now state police, but if there's someone else, please let me know so that we can make sure that we have them here. And certainly to all of our guests who came today, I know that you have so much more to do, and I know that y'all plate is extremely full. So I really thank you so much for spending half of your morning here, half of the day here, just being with us today. But if you can come back, or if you can listen and just send us notes as you're listening to us, and then again, giving us recommendations, which you have already given us a lot of recommendations, but if something else comes to mind, please let us know. This is a fiscal session, which means that we are limited to the number of bills. And so certainly I have that one bill, right? I have one bill that I was planning to use for this, but I'm trying to see if there's any way that we can work out something else, or if I can work with one of my colleagues who may have an extra bill that we can have some things filed. Because again, this is so, to me, at the crux of everything that we do. Protecting our children, to me, I believe, is our most important responsibility, because they've, A, depend on us to do that, B, they one day will become adults, and what has happened to them will have an impact on their life. And I think it's our responsibility.